Here's my round 5 play of the day from the Tal Memorial Tournament, and I've selected Levon Aronian against Alexander Morozevich. Well, okay, we joined the game after 10 moves. It was a Slav opening, a semi-Slav, and Morozevich has constructed this very aggressive setup, the so-called stonewall setup. So black clamps white in the centre. You'll notice that white can't break out because black has e4 firmly under control. Now the point is that this gives black a little bit of security in the middle, and that allows him to attack on the king side. So you can see that Morozevich has already swung the rook up the board, and he wants to swing it over and get some king side attack, maybe advancing the g-pawn afterwards. Well, this is very aggressive indeed. Aronian met this by playing knight d2. Now it looks slightly odd to bring the knight away from the king side, but the idea is very clear. If black were to play rook h6 in this position, threatening the pawn here, then you can just block it with f4, and the knight comes back to f3, and white has no difficulties whatsoever. In fact, you could say that maybe this knight doesn't look so great, and white can maybe start advancing on the queen side. So a solid reaction, and Morozevich thought for some time here, and he played an extraordinary move, e5, offering a pawn, and this just blows the game right open. I mean, this is such an adventurous move. Aronian captured the pawn on f5. And now Morozevich simply played e4. So you can see it's a kind of reverse French defence setup with this strong pawn chain. Nevertheless, black is a whole pawn down here. Aronian thought for quite a long time here what to do. Let's have a look and see what happens if he tries to keep hold of the pawn. For example, if he takes the knight here. Well, instead of recapturing immediately, I think it's best to play rook h6 straight away, attacking the pawn here. And now if, well, let's say h3, then black has a wonderful attack because, we're ready to sacrifice here and the queen comes across. I mean, this is perfect. So probably f4 is the best move. But even so, in this kind of position, black is still ready to bring the queen out. Okay, you can stop the immediate mate, but you can see the squares around here are very weak indeed, and black certainly has decent compensation. And one could play like this, but Aronian played more aggressively, more actively. He was going to fight fire with fire, and he took the pawn on h7. He sacrificed the piece, and he does that because he wants to destroy black's centre. So Morozevich played here to cover the king, and you can see now that, well, how many pawns does white have? 4 pawns for the piece, and the centre is being destroyed. So, well, let's see what happens. Morozevich is trying to bring his pieces out very quickly, and now f4. So this blunts the bishop, and now it's absolutely clear that black's attack is over, because all black's pieces have been blocked out from attacking the king, and this great avalanche of pawns is just starting to come down the board. Let's see, knight h6 from Morozevich. Now it's still not possible to advance. Of course, you'd like to play e4 and just push black's pieces out of the way, but in this case we can take here. And this is Aronian's problem, that it's not so simple to advance the pawns. He played knight e4, which looks very good. Queen f5, good move. So using the pin here to keep black's pawns and pieces in check. Okay, still looks fantastic for Aronian. The bishop came back. That's an interesting move. So preserving that bishop and covering the g5 square. And now, of course, if you take on b7, you don't want to play this because suddenly black's bishop is tremendous. So Aronian played c7. Now came rook c6, and I think this was a very important moment Aronian brought the queen back to b1, but it might have been better to play queen d3, and after the rook takes the pawn, then to advance the pawn, because in this way there is still perhaps chances to attack black's king. Now this is a very, very double-edged position. Black is not without chances here, in spite of, well, white has 4 pawns for the piece, but it's still not so clear. I think, given all the time in the world, then I think white should probably do very well in this position. But you can see that black can develop and hold up these pawns for a while. It's not possible to push with e5. So it's not so clear, but I think this is the way that Aronian should play, keeping the queens on the board. Instead he played queen b1, and after rook takes pawn, often an exchange of queens. Now I understand why he did this, because he was already running quite short of time. It's such a complex position. And it seems as though with 4 pawns for the piece, and nice pawns, central pawns, that this should be good for white. But incredibly, Morozevich managed to coordinate his pieces. Now that's an extraordinary move. You'd think blocking in the bishop looks dreadful. In fact, it's very strong. Because after this, b6, the bishop comes to the long diagonal, and you can see that black's pieces are beginning to coordinate. This is a very strong idea. And it means that after, for example, well, if white pushes here, then you can give a check, and suddenly knight g4, and black has excellent activity. So this is white's problem, that it's not so simple to push these pawns down the board. But if he can do it, then successfully, then of course he'll blow black's pieces away. Okay, h3 from Aronian. This looks okay to take the square away from the knight. Knight g8, so the knight no longer has prospects here and here, so the knight goes back, and maybe it can come out to f6 to tempt the pawn forward and then blockade. If black manages to blockade the pawns, then in spite of, you know, white having 4 of them, then black should be better. So this is the task of both players. Aronian has to keep these pawns fluid and flexible. Now he chose to play e5. I can understand why he did that, to prevent the knight coming to f6, but it does mean that black's task is clearer now. If he can push this knight out of the way, maybe with bishop b4, then he can blockade on the light squares, maybe the knight coming into e7 again. So this is difficult. I think the problem that Aronian had is that it's a lot easier for black to play this position. Having the pawns gives you great responsibility, and when you're short of time you have to play very accurately indeed, so it's a lot easier to play. By this stage Aronian had, well, 30 seconds left. Morozevich had 2.5 minutes. Bit easier to play for Morozevich. Okay, Aronian pushed. Maybe he should have played e5, but this is also not simple. I mean, this is a very sharp position, and I think it's understandable. You know, he didn't go for this. You need to calculate so carefully. You know, this kind of position, who knows what's happening? It's impossible to play this. You know, black suddenly has counterplay with these bishops against the king, even though these look very dangerous indeed. You've got to watch out for the bishops and the king. So d5 was played here, and now I think it's gone horribly wrong. Maybe he should have just given up this pawn on d5, but even this, I don't know. Somehow I think black has the better chances now, but I think that was the last hope. After e6, I don't like white's position at all. These pawns have gone too far, and the knight can come in to one of these squares to attack it. There's pressure here. It's basically Aronian is lost here. So that's the first pawn that's gone, and now look at these bishops slashing across the board. They're like snipers at the side of the board. It's very difficult to control the power of the bishops now. and you'll notice that g2 and the king are now a big target. Watch out for rook c2. And this pawn is going nowhere. It can be covered by the knight. Okay, let's just see how the game ended. The knight comes out to cover the bishop, and that's preempting rook c2, but now it's gone horribly wrong with black controlling the 7th rank. And that is a killing move. The bishop threatens f4, and there is no decent defence here. You can't play bishop e5, for example, then bishop e3, and the king is dead. Rook f1 played, bishop c1, threatening a killer check on g2, and now bishop f4, and well, these checks don't really help. The king finds safety here, and after this move Aronian resigned. I think that was a really tough one to lose for Aronian. He played so bravely in sacking this piece, but couldn't quite find the way forward. But fortune favours the brave, and I think a brilliant sacrifice, pawn sacrifice by Morozevich with e5 in the opening. That takes real guts to play like that. So Morozevich leads the tournament after 5 rounds with 4 points, but Carlsen won today, and he's coming back. He's coming forward in the tournament.